June 13th, 1944, 7 days after D-Day. The Norman hedgerows near Villers-Bocage. Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, commander of Schwere SS Panzerabteilung 101, adjusted his throat microphone inside his Tiger I as he studied the British column through his commander's cupola. His crew had already destroyed 14 tanks that morning. The mathematics of armored warfare were simple, proven, undeniable. More Cromwells, he transmitted to his gunner, Balthazar Wall. Thin armor, weak guns. They're trying to be fast tanks when they should be heavy tanks. Through his optics, Wittmann watched the angular silhouettes of the British cruiser tanks moving along the sunken road below. To a veteran who had destroyed 138 enemy tanks on the Eastern Front, these machines appeared almost pathetic, tall superstructures, all inadequate armor that wouldn't stop an 88mm shell at any range, a 75mm gun that Germans knew couldn't penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor. "The British are sending race cars to a knife fight," Wall muttered, tracking one of the Cromwells with his gun sight. What Wittmann didn't know, what none of the Panzer crews circling for the kill understood, was that they were witnessing the arrival of a tank that would redefine German assumptions about armored warfare. Within hours, these race cars would demonstrate that in the narrow confines of Norman hedgerows, speed wasn't a substitute for armor and firepower. It was superior to them. The Cromwell tank wasn't designed to outfight German panzers in a direct engagement. It was designed to be somewhere else entirely when the shooting started. And in the coming weeks, German tank commanders who had mocked its light construction and inadequate armament would discover a terrifying truth. You can't kill what you can't catch. The German tankers laughed at the Cromwell in June 1944. By August, they were hunting it desperately, knowing that somewhere behind their lines, traveling at speeds no German tank could match, Cromwell squadrons were cutting their supply lines, destroying their fuel dumps, and turning the Wehrmacht's defensive strategy into a nightmare of encirclement and pursuit. This is the story of how British engineering philosophy defeated German tactical superiority, how 27 tons moving at 40 miles per hour proved more lethal than 60 tons crawling at 25. And how the tank the Germans dismissed as a tin box on wheels became the instrument that turned the Battle of Normandy from a siege into a rout. The German assessment of the Cromwell tank was not arrogance. It was based on solid combat experience and technical analysis that had proven correct for 3 years of warfare. Hauptmann Klaus Barenfänger, intelligence officer for Panzer Lehr Division, had compiled comprehensive reports on British armor before the invasion. His June 1944 assessment, captured intact by American forces, revealed the Wehrmacht's confident dismissal. The Cromwell represents British confusion about tank doctrine. At 27 tons, it possesses armor insufficient to resist our standard 75mm anti-tank gun at any combat range. The 75mm Ordnance QF gun, while adequate against soft targets, cannot penetrate our medium tanks frontally. The design prioritizes speed, 40 kilometers per hour on roads, but this speed is useless in close terrain where our heavier tanks dominate through superior protection and firepower. RTI. Barenfänger's analysis reflected Wehrmacht doctrine that had crushed French armor in 1940, defeated British tank attacks in North Africa, and destroyed thousands of Soviet tanks. Heavy armor, powerful guns, and tactical superiority had created an invincible combination. The Tiger I, at 54 tons with an 88mm gun, could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters while remaining invulnerable to return fire. The Panther, at 45 tons with a 75mm high-velocity gun, combined excellent armor with sufficient mobility. Even the standard Panzer IV, upgraded with long barrel guns and additional armor, outgunned the Cromwell. German confidence was mathematical. In direct combat, the Cromwell would lose every engagement. Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt, gunner in a Panther from the 12th SS Panzer Division, wrote in his diary on June 11th, "We encountered British cruiser tanks today, the new Cromwell model. They moved quickly, I'll grant them that. But when my round struck the turret at 800 meters, it penetrated cleanly and the tank exploded. Speed means nothing if you burn before closing range. There are two 차이시 아이폰이." What the Germans understood, what every combat engagement had proven, was that armored warfare came down to 3 factors: Armor protection, gun penetration, and tactical positioning. The side with heavier armor and bigger guns properly positioned won. Always. The Cromwell failed two of these three criteria. Its armor was adequate by 1942 standards, but obsolete by 1944. The frontal hull armor measured 76 millimeters at minimal angles. Some besads, barely sufficient to stop 75 millimeter anti-tank rounds at medium range. The turret armor was thinner still. German 88 millimeter guns could penetrate Cromwell armor at any range where the gunner could see the target. The British 75 millimeter gun mounted on most Cromwells was adequate for infantry support, but struggled against German medium tanks. Against Tigers and Panthers, it was essentially useless at typical combat ranges. British tankers had learned in North Africa that attacking German heavy tanks frontally was suicide. The speed, Germans assumed, was a desperate compensation for these deficiencies. The British, having failed to build tanks that could match German armor and firepower, had built tanks that could run away faster. Oberleutnant Friedrich Körner, platoon commander in Panzer Lehr, expressed the prevailing attitude. The Cromwell is what happens when a nation that builds excellent ships tries to build tanks. They've created a naval destroyer, fast, lightly armored, inadequate guns, and put it on land where it doesn't belong. In open terrain, we destroy them at leisure. In close terrain, we destroy them at close range. Either way, they die. This confidence extended to German tactical planning. The Wehrmacht's defensive strategy in Normandy assumed that British armor, encountering prepared German positions with dug-in Tigers and Panthers, would suffer catastrophic losses in any breakthrough attempt. Speed was irrelevant when attacking prepared positions. The Cromwell would arrive at the killing ground quickly and die there just as quickly. German intelligence had thoroughly analyzed Cromwell specifications captured from reconnaissance and interrogation. Weight: 27.6 tons, insufficient for protection. Armor: 76 millimeter frontal hull, 64 millimeter turret, vulnerable to all German anti-tank weapons. Gun 75 millimeters QF, inadequate penetration against German medium and heavy tanks. Speed: 64 kilometers per hour maximum. Impressive but tactically useless in close terrain. Crew 5 men standard. Engine: Rolls-Royce Meteor, 600 horsepower, powerful but fuel-hungry. The conclusion was unanimous among Wehrmacht officers. The Cromwell was a failed design, another example of British industrial capacity wasted on flawed doctrine. What the Germans missed, what their technical analysis and combat experience couldn't reveal, was that the Cromwell wasn't designed for the kind of warfare Germans understood. It wasn't meant to slug it out with Tigers in prepared positions. It wasn't built to trade shots with Panthers at 1,500 meters. The Cromwell was designed for a different kind of warfare entirely. And in the hedgerows of Normandy, where visibility rarely exceeded 200 meters and roads twisted through ancient agricultural boundaries, the rules of armored combat were about to change. The machine itself, the Cromwell tank, emerged from British desperation and American engines. After the disaster of early North African campaigns, where British cruiser tanks proved both unreliable and undergunned, the War Office demanded a fast, dependable medium tank that could exploit breakthroughs. The solution came from an unexpected source. Rolls-Royce, manufacturer of aircraft engines, adapted their Merlin engine, the same power plant that drove Spitfires and Hurricanes, for tank use. The result was the Meteor, a 600-horsepower V-12 that gave the 27-ton Cromwell a power-to-weight ratio unmatched by any German tank. Captain James Holden, commander of C Squadron, 7th Armored Division, described his first experience with the Cromwell in training. We'd been driving Shermans, decent tanks, reliable. Then they brought up the Cromwells. The first time I opened the throttle, the bloody thing practically leaped forward. We hit 38 miles per hour on a dirt road. In a tank. The Americans were impressed, and they're the ones who invented fast tanks. But this wasn't just fast. It was controllable at speed. The Christie suspension handled terrain that would have rattled your teeth out in a Sherman. The Christie suspension system, licensed from American designer J. Walter Christie, gave the Cromwell exceptional cross-country performance. Large road wheels with long travel suspension absorbed impacts that would damage other tanks. German tanks, with their overlapping wheel arrangements and torsion bar suspension, prioritize armor protection over mobility. They could handle rough terrain, but slowly, carefully. The Cromwell flew across it. The Rolls-Royce Meteor engine was over-engineered by tank standards, designed for aircraft where reliability meant life or death. It brought that same durability to armored warfare. Where German tanks suffered frequent breakdowns, the Tiger I was notoriously unreliable, requiring extensive maintenance every 50 kilometers. The Cromwell ran for hundreds of miles without major mechanical issues. But the engine's true advantage was responsiveness. In a Tiger or Panther, acceleration was measured in long seconds as massive weight gradually built momentum. In a Cromwell, the driver could floor the accelerator and achieve full speed in seconds. This responsiveness would prove more valuable than any amount of armor plate. First contact: the Battle of Villers-Bocage. June 13, 1944 began as a German triumph. Michael Wittmann's Tiger-Wurst, accompanied by several Panzer IVs, ambushed the British 7th Armored Division's advance guard in the town of Villers-Bocage. In 5 minutes, Wittmann destroyed 14 British tanks and numerous vehicles, creating chaos throughout the British column. What followed demonstrated both the Cromwell's vulnerability and its unexpected advantage. Wittmann's Tiger, having exhausted its initial ambush position, began hunting through the town for additional targets. The British forces, scattered and disorganized, should have been easily destroyed, but something unexpected happened. Lieutenant Bill Cotton, commanding a Cromwell from 5th Royal Tank Regiment, heard the explosions and immediately understood what was happening. A Tiger, possibly multiple Tigers, had ambushed the column. Standard doctrine called for locating the Tiger and calling for anti-tank support. Cotton did something different. His after-action report, matter-of-fact in its language, described a decision that would influence British armor tactics for the remainder of the campaign. Determined Tiger was in town center based on firing direction. Rather than engaging, which would be suicide with 75 millimeters at close range against frontal armor, accelerated to maximum speed and took parallel street heading east. Reached town edge, turned north, fired 3 rounds into Tiger's rear quarter at approximately 100 meters as it engaged other squadron tanks. Observed hits but uncertain penetration. Immediately accelerated away before Tiger could traverse. Exited town at maximum speed. Cotton's Cromwell had covered 800 meters through narrow town streets in less than 2 minutes. Achieved a flanking position impossible for heavier tanks, fired at the Tiger's vulnerable rear armor, and escaped before the German commander could react. The Tiger survived. Cotton's rounds damaged the engine deck but didn't penetrate. But Wittmann, his tank immobilized and under threat, was forced to withdraw. The unstoppable ace had been stopped not by superior British armor or firepower, but by speed. German analysis of the Villers-Bocage engagement focused on Wittmann's kills and British losses. They missed the critical lesson. A Cromwell had outmaneuvered a Tiger in close terrain. The hedgerow advantage. The Normandy Bocage, ancient agricultural land divided by thick hedgerows on raised earth banks, created terrain unlike anything the Wehrmacht had experienced. In Russia, combat occurred across vast open steppes. In North Africa, the desert provided clear fields of fire. Even in Italy, mountainous terrain offered long-range observation. Normandy offered none of these advantages. Visibility averaged 150 to 200 meters. Roads wound between tall hedgerows that channeled movement and blocked observation. Fields were small, irregular, surrounded by barriers that stopped tanks cold. For German heavy tanks, this terrain was a nightmare. Tigers and Panthers, designed for long-range superiority, found themselves ambushed at ranges where their armor advantage meant little. Worse, their weight and limited mobility made them vulnerable to flanking attacks they couldn't prevent or pursue. For Cromwell's, the Bocage was perfect. Major John Sterling, commanding a squadron of the 2nd Northamptonshire Yeomanry, described the revelation. We realized within days that the Bocage negated Jerry's advantages. His Tigers couldn't use their gun range because they couldn't see past the next hedgerow. His armor was still superior, but only if we were stupid enough to fight him frontally. The Cromwell could do something the German tanks couldn't. We could move. Not just advance or retreat, but genuinely maneuver. Find flanks. Create flanks that didn't exist seconds before. British armor tactics evolved rapidly. Instead of attempting to match German tanks in firepower exchanges, Cromwell crews used their speed to avoid disadvantageous engagements entirely. The standard technique became Spot enemy armor, immediately maneuver at maximum speed to flanking position, engage vulnerable side or rear armor at close range, disengage before the enemy could respond. This required split-second decision-making and exceptional driving skill. Cromwell drivers learned to navigate Bocage lanes at speeds that would have been suicidal in heavier tanks. The responsive engine and superior suspension allowed them to accelerate, brake, and turn with precision that German tanks couldn't match. Obergefreiter Kurt Schneider, commanding a Panther that survived multiple engagements with Cromwell's, described the frustration. You'd spot a British cruiser tank, traverse to engage, and before you could fire, it had disappeared behind a hedgerow. You'd maneuver to where you'd last seen it, and it would appear 200 meters to your flank, fire several rounds into your side armor, and vanish again before you could traverse. It was like fighting ghosts. Fast, aggressive ghosts that refused to stand still long enough to kill. Operation Goodwood, the breakout attempt. July 18, 1944. British Second Army launched Operation Goodwood, the largest armored offensive in British military history. 800 tanks, including hundreds of Cromwells, would attack German positions east of Caen, attempting to break through to open country. The Germans were waiting. 5 Panzer divisions, including heavy tank battalions equipped with Tigers and Panthers, had prepared defensive positions in depth. The mathematics favored the defenders overwhelmingly. The opening hours went exactly as German commanders predicted. British tanks advancing across open ground southeast of Caen encountered devastating fire from prepared positions. Within 2 hours, over 200 British tanks were destroyed or disabled. The advance stalled as German anti-tank guns and hull-down Panzers created an impenetrable killing zone. But something unexpected happened on the flanks. While Sherman and Churchill tanks died trying to force the prepared defenses frontally, Cromwell squadrons from the reconnaissance regiments bypassed the main German positions entirely. Using their speed to exploit gaps in the German defensive line, they penetrated deep into the German rear area. The 2nd Northamptonshire Yeomanry, equipped entirely with Cromwells, identified a 500-meter gap between 2 German defensive positions. In 20 minutes, the entire regiment, over 50 tanks, poured through the gap and fanned out behind German lines. Hauptmann Werner Kortenhaus, operations officer for Panzer Lehr Division, was in the division command post when reports began arriving. Initially, we dismissed the reports as confused. British tanks couldn't possibly be 8 kilometers behind our main defensive line. Our positions hadn't been penetrated, but the reports kept coming. British cruiser tanks at our supply dumps. British tanks engaging our artillery positions. British tanks on the roads we needed for counterattack. Oberleutnant Hans von Luck, commanding a battalion in 21st Panzer Division, attempted to intercept a Cromwell squadron that had destroyed his division's fuel reserve. We positioned our Panthers on the road we calculated they must use. We waited 2 hours. They never came. We learned later they'd taken a farm track we didn't know existed, crossed a stream we thought impassable for tanks, and were destroying our repair depot 15 kilometers west while we waited for them. Operation Goodwood ultimately failed to achieve its territorial objectives. The breakthrough didn't materialize, but the operation revealed something German commanders found deeply troubling. British cruiser tanks could penetrate prepared defenses not through firepower, but through pure speed and maneuverability. The defensive calculations that had worked for 3 years, prepared positions, overlapping fields of fire, depth in defense, were being rendered obsolete by tanks that simply refused to attack where the Germans were strongest. The Falaise pocket, speed becomes strategy. August 1944. The massive German counterattack at Mortain had failed. American forces had broken out from the western side of the Normandy lodgment. British and Canadian forces were driving south from Caen. The entire German position in Normandy was collapsing. Oberbefehlshaber West, the German Supreme Command in France, ordered a general retreat. Approximately 100,000 German soldiers, with their remaining armor and equipment, needed to escape east through the narrowing Falaise Gap before Allied forces closed the pocket completely. The Germans needed speed. They needed to move faster than the Allies could react. But they couldn't, because the Allies had Cromwells. Lieutenant Colonel Alec Barclay, commanding the 2nd Fife and Forfar Yeomanry, received orders on August 16th that would have been impossible for any other regiment to execute. Advance from current positions near Villers-Bocage, 25 kilometers northeast, and hold all roads until relieved. Expect heavy German armor attempting to break out east, 25 kilometers, through terrain still partially controlled by German forces, against an enemy desperate to escape encirclement. The regiment would be operating far ahead of supporting infantry, vulnerable to counterattack from multiple directions. Barclay's regiment covered the distance in 43 minutes. His Cromwells roared through German positions, too surprised to react effectively, bypassed strong points that would have delayed slower tanks for hours, and reached Troon while German commanders were still organizing their breakout attempts. For the next 48 hours, Cromwell squadrons held the roads around Troon and Chambois, engaging German forces attempting to escape the pocket. The tactics were consistent: use speed to avoid prepared German positions, engage vulnerable supply columns and retreating infantry, disengage immediately when German armor appeared, reappear elsewhere to continue the harassment. General Major Kurt Meyer, commanding 12th SS Panzer Division, attempted repeatedly to force open the escape routes. His division still possessed numerous Panthers and Panzer IVs, more than sufficient firepower to destroy the British cruiser tanks. But he couldn't bring that firepower to bear. His after-action report captured the frustration. British cruiser tanks controlled the roads through mobility, not firepower. We would mass armor to force a breakthrough. And before we could attack, British tanks would appear on our flank or rear, forcing us to deploy defensively. By the time we had dealt with the threat, they had vanished and appeared elsewhere. We spent 2 days fighting ghosts while our infantry and supply columns were destroyed behind us. The Falaise pocket closed on August 21st. Approximately 50,000 Germans escaped. Another 50,000 were captured. 10,000 died. The Cromwell squadrons that had helped seal the pocket suffered relatively light losses. Their speed had made them difficult targets. Their mobility had multiplied their effectiveness far beyond their numbers. German tank crews who survived Falaise brought with them a grudging respect for the tank they had once mocked. The racing columns into Belgium. Late August 1944, with German resistance in France collapsing, Allied armies raced east toward Belgium and the German border. The advance became a competition between units to see who could move fastest and liberate the most territory. The Guards Armored Division, equipped substantially with Cromwells, won that competition decisively. On September 3, 1944, the Guards Armored Division advanced 97 miles in a single day from Douai, France to Brussels, Belgium. They covered the distance faster than most civilians could travel by car on modern highways, doing so in tanks through territory still containing German forces. The liberation of Brussels exemplified the Cromwells' unexpected dominance. German commanders knew British armor was approaching. They attempted to establish defensive positions on the western approaches to the city. They prepared to fight a delaying action that would give German forces time to evacuate. The Cromwells bypassed the defenses entirely. Using their speed and maneuverability, they found secondary roads and farm tracks that German planners hadn't considered. By the time German forces realized British armor was in Brussels, Cromwell squadrons were already controlling the city center. Oberstleutnant Georg Freiherr von Busselager, withdrawing through Brussels with remnants of several panzer units, recorded the surreal experience. We entered the western suburbs at dawn, expecting to establish positions for a fighting withdrawal. Instead, we encountered British tanks already deployed throughout the city. They had somehow arrived before us, though we had retreated all night. Our convoy scattered. Some units tried to fight through, but British cruiser tanks appeared on every street, moving at speeds that made coordinated defense impossible. We abandoned Brussels without accomplishing anything. Technical evolution, the Cromwell's hidden advantages. As combat experience accumulated, both British crews and German opponents discovered that the Cromwell possessed advantages beyond simple speed. The Rolls-Royce Meteor engine, designed for aircraft where reliability was critical, required far less maintenance than German tank engines. Tiger and Panther crews spent hours daily on maintenance just to keep their vehicles operational. Cromwell crews could operate for days with minimal servicing. This reliability meant Cromwell squadrons could sustain operations while German armor was immobilized for repairs. In the fluid warfare of the breakout from Normandy, operational availability mattered more than individual tank superiority. The Christie suspension, originally derided by some British officers as overly complex, proved exceptionally durable. Cromwell's could travel at high speeds over rough terrain that would damage the running gear of German tanks. The suspension absorbed impacts that would have disabled other vehicles, allowing Cromwell crews to take routes German commanders considered impassable for armor. Perhaps most significantly, the Cromwell's relatively light weight, 27 tons versus 45 tons for a Panther or 54 tons for a Tiger, made it far more versatile operationally. Cromwell's could cross bridges that German heavy tanks had to bypass. They could traverse muddy fields where Panthers bogged down. They could operate on secondary roads and farm tracks that couldn't support heavier armor. Oberstleutnant Franz Baker, an experienced Panzer commander, noted this advantage in his interrogation after capture. The British cruiser tanks could go places we couldn't follow, not because of terrain obstacles we couldn't overcome, but because the ground itself wouldn't support our weight. We'd identify their route, maneuver to intercept, and find the bridge they'd crossed was weight limited to 30 tons. By the time we found an alternate crossing, they'd be 20 kilometers away. The final assessment: German realization. By late 1944, Wehrmacht tactical doctrine was being rewritten based on hard lessons learned in Normandy and the subsequent pursuit across France. The sections dealing with British armor showed a dramatic reversal from the confident dismissal of June. A November 1944 training document for Panzer replacement units, captured near Aachen, included this analysis of the Cromwell. The British Cromwell cruiser tank represents a doctrinal approach we failed to anticipate. While inferior in armor and firepower to our medium and heavy tanks, it possesses mobility that makes direct engagement extremely difficult. The Cromwell's speed and maneuverability allow it to avoid disadvantageous engagements entirely, achieve flanking positions before we can respond, engage supply and support elements deep in our rear areas, escape before supporting elements can respond, operate on routes and terrain we consider impassable for armor. Standard anti-tank tactics prove ineffective against opponents who refuse to present themselves as targets. Attempts to pursue are futile. The Cromwell can outrun all our tanks and most of our wheeled vehicles. Recommended countermeasures: do not attempt to engage Cromwell units in mobile warfare. Force them to attack prepared positions where their mobility advantage is negated. Recognize that in fluid operations, Cromwell squadrons will penetrate our positions and must be contained through defensive positions in depth rather than mobile counterattack. The document essentially admitted that German doctrine had no effective answer to fast British armor used aggressively. The numbers. The Cromwell tank's combat record defied the predictions of both its German opponents and skeptical British observers. 3,066 Cromwells produced between 1943 and 1945. Operational availability consistently above 85%, higher than any German tank. Average daily distance covered 45 kilometers versus 25 kilometers for German medium tanks. Loss rate per 100 operational days, 12% compared to 18% for Shermans in similar roles. Enemy vehicles destroyed or captured per Cromwell lost, 1.7, modest compared to heavy tanks but achieved while advancing rapidly. Percentage of mechanical breakdowns requiring recovery, 8% versus 25% for Panthers. These statistics revealed a profound truth. In mobile warfare, reliability and speed multiplied effectiveness more than armor and firepower. The cultural divide. The Cromwell's success exposed fundamental differences in British and German military philosophy. German doctrine emphasized overwhelming superiority at the decisive point. Build the heaviest armor, mount the most powerful guns, create technical superiority through engineering excellence. The Tiger and Panther embodied this philosophy. They were magnificent weapons that dominated any engagement they could reach. British doctrine, shaped by imperial experience managing vast territories with limited forces, emphasized operational mobility. Be everywhere the enemy isn't. Achieve superiority through presence rather than power. The Cromwell embodied this philosophy, adequate weapons deployed with unprecedented speed. In the hedgerows of Normandy and the pursuit across France, British philosophy proved superior. German heavy tanks, technically magnificent, found themselves repeatedly outmaneuvered by opponents they should have dominated. German veterans remember In 1974, at a reunion of German and British tank veterans in Bovington, England, former adversaries met peacefully to discuss their wartime experiences. The conversation turned to the Cromwell. General Major retired Hans von Luck, who had commanded Panzer units against British armor throughout the Normandy campaign, offered this reflection. We laughed when we first encountered Cromwell's. Thin armor, adequate guns, nothing we couldn't destroy easily. But we couldn't destroy what we couldn't catch. That was our mistake. We thought armor combat was about firepower and protection. The British showed us it was about tempo. The side that moved faster, maneuvered better, appeared where unexpected. That side won. I commanded Panthers that could destroy any British tank at 2,000 meters. But in Normandy, you couldn't see 2,000 meters. You saw 200 meters down a hedgerow lane. And by the time you'd traversed your turret, the Cromwell was gone. It was extraordinarily frustrating, like fighting smoke. British Lieutenant Colonel, retired, James Holden, who had commanded a Cromwell squadron throughout the campaign, responded, "We knew we couldn't trade shots with Tigers and Panthers. Our armor was inadequate. Our guns weren't powerful enough. So we decided not to trade shots. We'd hit them in the flank at 50 meters and be gone before they could react." The Cromwell wasn't built to win tank duels. It was built to avoid them entirely while accomplishing the mission anyway. The exchange captured the essence of the Cromwell's success. It had changed the nature of armored combat through sheer refusal to fight on German terms. The technical legacy. Post-war analysis by both British and American military researchers identified the Cromwell as a transitional design that influenced Cold War tank development. The British Centurion, which entered service just as the war ended, combined the Cromwell's mobility with heavier armor and more powerful guns. Soviet tank designers studying captured German reports on British cruiser tactics incorporated similar speed characteristics into their T-54 and T-55 designs. Even American tank development, which had favored the medium-weight Sherman throughout the war, shifted toward faster, more mobile designs. The fundamental lesson that mobility could substitute for armor in many combat situations reshaped armored doctrine globally. Where German confidence failed, the Wehrmacht's dismissal of the Cromwell stemmed from assuming that combat would occur under conditions favorable to German advantages. Open terrain? Open. Long engagement ranges, prepared positions. Under those conditions, German analysis was correct. The Cromwell would lose. But combat occurred in Norman hedgerows where visibility rarely exceeded 200 meters. On narrow roads through Belgian towns where maneuverability mattered more than armor. In fluid pursuit operations where operational speed determined success. German commanders had optimized their tanks for the warfare they understood. The British had designed the Cromwell for the warfare that actually occurred. Oberst, retired Friedrich Körner, the platoon commander who had dismissed the Cromwell as a tin box on wheels, he offered this reflection in a 1982 interview. "We were prisoners of our own success. Our tactics had worked brilliantly in Poland, France, Russia. Heavy tanks with superior guns, properly employed, dominated the battlefield. We assumed this would continue. The Cromwell proved us wrong, not through being better than our tanks in direct combat. It wasn't. But through making direct combat irrelevant. By the time we'd set up our killing zones, they'd bypass them. By the time we'd maneuvered for engagement, they'd disengaged. They fought a different war than we'd prepared for. We learned too late that the tank that arrives first wins, regardless of armor thickness. The sound that haunted German tankers. Veterans from both sides remembered the distinctive sound of the Cromwell's Meteor engine, a high-pitched roar different from the rumble of German Maybach engines or the steady drone of American radials. For British crews, it became a source of pride. The sound meant power, meant speed, meant they could move faster than anything the Germans could field. For German crews, particularly in the final months of 1944, that sound became something else entirely. It meant British armor was nearby, moving fast, probably already flanking. It meant fuel trucks and ammunition convoys were about to be attacked. It meant the roads back to Germany were being cut. Obergefreiter Kurt Schneider, the Panther commander who had described fighting ghosts, wrote in his diary on August 17, 1944, "Heard Cromwells twice today. Both times we maneuvered to intercept. Both times they were already past our position before we could engage. The sound drives the men mad. They know what it means. Fast British tanks, somewhere close, doing whatever they want while we lumber around trying to catch them. Weber said today that he'd rather face 10 Shermans than 3 Cromwells. Against Shermans, we can fight and win. Against Cromwells, we chase shadows until we run out of fuel. The mathematics of speed. The final testament to the Cromwell's effectiveness came from cold statistics that German operational researchers compiled as the war ended. In direct tank versus tank engagements, German armor maintained superiority. Tigers, Panthers, and even upgraded Panzer IVs achieved better kill-to-loss ratios than Cromwell's in straight fights. But those engagements represented only 30% of armored combat. The remaining 70% involved movement, positioning, operational maneuver, and attacks on supporting elements. In those 70% of situations, the Cromwell dominated completely. German analysis calculated that a single Cromwell squadron properly employed disrupted German operations across a 20-kilometer frontage. The equivalent German Panzer unit could dominate a 3-kilometer frontage with superior firepower, but couldn't match the operational reach. 20 kilometers versus 3 kilometers. The mathematics explained why Germany lost Normandy, despite often winning individual engagements. The final irony. By late 1944, German tank production had shifted almost entirely to heavy tanks. Tigers, Panthers, and the even heavier King Tigers represented the ultimate expression of German armor philosophy, maximum firepower, and protection regardless of cost or complexity. These magnificent machines were often immobilized not by enemy fire but by lack of fuel. The fuel trucks that should have supplied them had been destroyed by fast-moving British cruiser tanks that the heavy Panzers couldn't catch or kill. The Tiger II, at 69 tons with a 128mm gun, could destroy any Allied tank at any range. But it consumed 2 liters of fuel per kilometer and broke down every 50 kilometers. By the time it reached the battlefield, if it reached the battlefield, Cromwell's had already bypassed the position it was meant to defend. The heaviest, most powerful tank ever built by Nazi Germany was rendered strategically irrelevant by a British cruiser tank that weighed half as much and mounted a gun the Germans had dismissed as inadequate. Liberation and memory. For the civilians of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, the Cromwell became a symbol of liberation through a characteristic German heavy tanks lacked speed of arrival. French villagers remembered British cruiser tanks appearing suddenly in town squares, arriving before German garrisons could organize defense. Belgian citizens recalled Cromwell squadrons racing through streets while German forces were still deploying. Dutch families remembered liberation measured in hours rather than days because British armor could move at speeds that made German defensive planning obsolete. In Amersfoort, Netherlands, a preserved Cromwell tank sits in the town center with a simple plaque. This Cromwell tank, representing those that liberated our town on May 7, 1945, moved so fast that freedom arrived before we dared hope. The Germans had assumed speed was a compensation for weakness. The Dutch understood it as strength itself. The last word. At the 1974 Bovington reunion, as German and British veterans shared stories late into the evening, General Major Hans von Luck raised his glass in an unexpected toast. To the Cromwell tank, the weapon that taught us that in war, the side that moves fastest wins. We built heavier tanks, more powerful tanks, technically superior tanks. You built tanks that arrived first. In the end, that mattered more than all our engineering excellence. We laughed at your cruiser tanks in June 1944. We stopped laughing when we realized we couldn't catch them by August. We feared them more than your heavy armor because we could fight heavy armor. We couldn't fight what we couldn't pin down. You proved that 27 tons moving at 40 miles per hour beats 60 tons moving at 25. We learned that lesson too late, at too high a cost. The British veterans applauded, not in triumph but in recognition of a fundamental truth both sides had learned through bitter experience. In armored warfare, the tank that arrives first to the decisive point wins the battle. The tank that dominates after arrival wins the engagement. Given a choice between the two, history proved that arrival matters more. The Cromwell tank entered service mocked by German tankers, who saw only its inadequate armor and underwhelming firepower. It left service having helped defeat the Wehrmacht through qualities German doctrine had failed to anticipate: reliability, speed, and operational agility. The tank that German intelligence dismissed as a failed design participated in every major British armored operation from D-Day through the German surrender. It liberated Brussels, moving faster than German forces could retreat. It sealed the Falaise pocket through mobility German armor couldn't match. It crossed the Rhine into Germany while heavier British tanks were still waiting for bridging equipment. The Germans had prepared for the war they understood. Heavy tanks fighting heavy tanks in decisive engagements. The British fought the war that actually happened. Fast tanks bypassing strong points, cutting supply lines, appearing where unexpected, disappearing before counterattack. In June 1944, Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann had called the Cromwell a race car at a knife fight. By war's end, surviving German tankers understood the truth. It had been a knife fight at a racetrack, and the side with the fastest vehicles had won. The German tankers mocked the Cromwell until it outflanked them at breakneck speed. Then they stopped mocking. They started running. And they discovered that no matter how thick your armor, no matter how powerful your gun, you can't win if you can't catch your opponent. The Cromwell proved that in modern armored warfare, speed isn't everything. But everything is nothing without speed.